Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Transfiguration Catholic Church, whether you're here live or whether you're joining us via live stream. My name is Father John Paul Erickson. I have the great privilege of serving as pastor here at Transfiguration. And whether you are a parishioner or a friend of Dr. Jessica Chastek or an admirer of Father Baer, we're very, very grateful that you are here. Shortly after my arrival in 2018 here at Transfiguration, the Lord put on my heart a desire to honor Father Baer in some sort of substantial way. Father Baer, for those who may not know, was the 9th pastor of this parish and died quite unexpectedly after 8 years of noble and fervent service to this community. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't thank God for the gift of following in the footsteps of such a man who many of you loved as a friend. Prior to his service at Transfiguration, Father Baer was rector of St. John Vianney Seminary for well over a decade, during which time the seminary grew in numbers, fervor, and identity, becoming the strongest college seminary in the nation, a reputation I believe it still deserves today. Father Baer was a renowned homilist and speaker, and his clarity, conviction, and humor helped many to know and to love Jesus. It's only fitting then to honor Father Baer with a speaker series in which equally renowned speakers will share with us wisdom and insight into the Catholic faith and other matters which touch upon the fundamental call of the human person. The timing of this series is not accidental, as the month of August is dedicated to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. This is the first lecture of the year, but there'll be more, but we're still starting in August. And it's to this image, the image of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, burning with love, that we entrust the series tonight and our effort to honor a beloved priest, servant, and Son of God. So please join me. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Saint Joseph, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Well, Dr. Jessica Chastek is a familiar face to anyone who is a regular at Transfiguration. She and her husband, the other Dr. Chastek, have been members here for 6 years and have been pillars, and I mean that, pillars, for as long as I've been here, and that's just over 5. Her love for her faith, for her family, and this community has been a source of great inspiration to me, and I could not be more delighted that she accepted the invitation to be the first speaker in this year's Father Baer series. Having received her BA from the University of Dallas in politics in 1998, she holds a PhD in American government politics from Claremont Graduate University in California and has taught at USC San Bernardino, Macalester College here in St. Paul, in addition to serving at the Rose Institute of State and Local Government in Claremont McKenna College. And while the name may not mean much to some of you, she was a student and colleague of the important political philosopher Harry Jaffa, himself an expert on the political philosophy of Abraham Lincoln and the traditional foundations of the founding of this nation. It was Dr. Jaffa, and I should have ran this quotation by Dr. Chastek before I shared it. I'll let her say if she's proud of it or not. But it was Dr. Jaffa who composed the line in Barry Goldwater's acceptance speech, which said, "I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and let me remind you that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue." Her academic cred and her current gig with Pampered Chef, assisting working parents to provide great, easy meals for busy families, is marvelously melded in the fact that Dr. Jaffa's dining room table is currently in her home, and she uses every day. But before all else, Dr. Chastek is Jessie to her beloved husband, and her mom to her wondrous and delightful children. I've spoken of her cred in the field of academia in the kitchen, but she's also the pilot of that Catholic ATV vehicle, which you will so often see in our parking lot, driving her 6 kids literally all around the Twin Cities, from Hopkins to Oakdale and back, and wherever else her zealous and entrepreneurial soul will take her. Finally, I promise you finally, Dr. Chastek is a woman of great faith, a regular attendee at daily Mass, and a woman who has shown me the great importance of fighting for what one believes in, including our beloved school. And I'm honored to call her and her family members parishioners, and I'm very grateful to invite her to the Sambo to speak with us tonight on the topic, How Did We Get Here? The Moral Foundations of American Politics. This will be the first lecture we've had here at the Baer lecture series in which there'll be a time of Q&A afterwards. That'll take place immediately after the lecture, and then we'll proceed out to the gathering space for a little reception in Dr. Chastek's honor. Dr. Chastek, the floor is yours.
I want to make sure I don't go too long, so I'm setting a timer. Thank you, Father Erickson. It's a great honor and it's a delight to be invited to be part of this lecture series. Father Baer is known and loved for many reasons, but one of the most important was his homilies. He was able effortlessly to communicate important truths using plain language and without compromise or equivocation. This ability endeared him to many in this parish and throughout the Archdiocese and beyond, but it also made him unpopular with those who preferred to live their faith in ambiguity or even in defiance of church teachings. And it's in light of Father Baer's legacy of speaking truth in plain language with the purpose of informing the good life that I've taken my inspiration for tonight's lecture. Usually when people learn that my PhD is in political philosophy, their reaction is a blank stare. They're not really sure what to make of that. Is it more philosophy or politics? Will this be accessible to the unschooled? Am I a sociopath? Because really, why would you study politics? Isn't that what they do in the swamp? So no, I'm not a sociopath, and yes, this discussion should be accessible to the unschooled. The enduring question of political philosophy is the question of how we order political association so that man can achieve his highest end. Really, it's the question of how do we justify empowering some men to impose their judgments on everyone else. In a free regime, the ability to answer these questions in simple, straightforward, and compelling ways is essential. Understanding the logic of morals that animates our political institutions is essential for anyone who wants to preserve liberty, and undermining this logic of morals is essential to anyone who wishes to destroy freedom. As citizens in a free regime, we must be able and willing to engage in candid conversations about the logic of morals because these conversations are crucial for restoring the culture of civic friendship, which is indisputable support of a healthy, free political institution. If any of you are up to date on your catechism in a year with Father Mike, you will remember that he recently referenced the work of Christian Smith, a sociologist from Notre Dame, who has done extensive research on the way emerging adults make sense of moral choices. How do young people think about moral choices? Smith notes that a majority of young people lack the moral language to engage moral problems or dilemmas in a meaningful way, and many seem unaware that they even confront such dilemmas. More than half of the participants responded that morality is a personal choice, entirely a matter of individual decision. Rather than classifying things as right or wrong, good or bad, they would describe things as dumb or stupid. Well, that might be right or wrong for you, but not for me. Losing our moral language or our ability to engage in moral conversations is disastrous for politics, but especially in a free regime. Despite assertions that moral relativism should be more inclusive, I would argue that the history of the 20th century demonstrates that the opposite is true. Moral relativism leads to authoritarianism and more divisive politics. And this is where we are right now in America, a people increasingly lacking the vocabulary or intellectual framework to have reasonable discussions about the most important political issues of our day. When Father invited me to give a talk on some theme in American politics, I was happy to accept because I love America. I love America not only because she is mine and I am an American, but because I think that America as she was founded is good. And I believe that America has been the greatest secular force for freedom and human flourishing in the world. Even today, still, with all of her warts and imperfections, I believe that America is a good enterprise and one worth fighting for, and whose founding principles should be restored to their preeminent place in our national life. America came into existence as a sovereign nation at a specific moment in history, and was able to do so because of specific intellectual and moral or social developments that were taking place across the globe. But America is not simply a product of that moment in history. Rather, the shape that the new nation took, the specific attributes that the new regime assumed, were the product of reflection and choice by the brave men who took action at that moment. Our national charter and our national character are uniquely American, and were not mere accidents of history. This is remarkable in the history of the world. It's easy for us to take for granted the blessings of liberty that we have inherited: relative peace, prosperity, and political stability. But consider that just a few years after our own revolution, the French Revolution, which was born of many of the same intellectual and socio-political influence, took a very different turn with the Reign of Terror and produced a very different outcome. France has had 12 governments since 1791. We've had one. Unlike the church, which Christ promises the gates of hell will not prevail against, America and the American project can be lost if we forget or reject her founding principles. Abraham Lincoln observed in his Lyceum address in 1838, At what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. I think this is still the case. Surprisingly, in some circles, especially in elite academic circles, loving America because you believe she is good, specifically that the founding is praiseworthy, has become a very controversial position to hold. And wading into a discussion about the moral foundations of American politics is even more controversial. There is increasingly a belief that morals and moral opinion have no place in American politics. How many of you, if you dare to offer an unpopular opinion about a political issue, abortion, marriage, gender issues, taxation, COVID, how many of you have been chastised not to try and impose your morals on anyone else? This is in part because people often conflate morality with religion, or they reduce religion to morality and therefore claim that the American founding, which is based on a separation of church and state, demands the exclusion of sectarian moral principles from political life. But more than that, this chastisement is a declaration of moral relativism, an intellectual movement that is explicitly rejected by the principles of the American founding. Politics is the arena of moral questions because political associations are defined by the law, and the law is the power to oblige and bind even those who disagree. And law teaches those governed what is right or wrong, better or worse, just or unjust. The law says you ought to do this or you ought not to do that. The ought contained in that sentence is the statement of moral judgment. Moral judgment involves matters of irreducible practical importance. Whether we're seeking to change or resist change, every act involves practical judgment, and it implies at least some rough notion of things that are good or bad, better or worse, just or unjust. And political associations do not exist merely for the sake of safety or order, or to enforce contracts or provide a flourishing economy. Those could be accomplished without law. Aristotle says that the political association is as natural for human beings as the family. It emanates from something in human nature. He says that the political association is the most sovereign and inclusive association and is therefore a reflection of what is the most sovereign and inclusive in human nature. Humans are suitable by nature for political life in ways that other animals are not. Anyone who is outside of the polity or outside of the political regimes is beneath the teaching and restraint of the law, which makes them a beast, or is above the law with no need for the restraint of instruction of the law, which makes them a god. So anyone who is outside of the reach of politics is either a beast or a god. So if the polity, an association governed by law, is a reflection of human nature, then it is a reflection of that which is most distinctly human. And we can know what is most distinctly human through our unassisted human reason. And this claim that we can know things absolutely and universally about what it means to be human is foundational to the American regime. When the Continental Congress published its unanimous Declaration of Independence, the framers were not just producing a poetic birth of a nation announcement. The Declaration of Independence is a political treatise, and it is a statement of faith for America, an articulation of what our founders believed were axiomatic truths about political associations. It referenced not only rights, but also sacred duties and obligations. This at its essence is the logic of morals that animates the entire American project from the founding period until the progressive era. Before stating these axioms, the authors of the Declaration observed that when it becomes necessary for people to engage in revolution and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the cause which impel them to the separation. So we're going to unpack this. The founders wrote the Declaration out of respect for the opinions of mankind. And they grounded their actions in a recognition of the laws of nature and nature's God. To be clear, okay, so what are the laws of nature and nature's God? To be clear, the founders were not appealing to a Christian God. They were not founding a Christian nation. America is not and has never been a Christian nation. However, it is a nation that was founded among and uniquely fitting a predominantly Christian population. But it's never been a Christian nation. John Adams, a devout Christian, famously observed, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." So while there were many faithful Christians among the founders, there were also many deists and agnostics. No one has ever needed to profess belief in the triune God to be a good American. But it is certainly the case that the Christian virtues were an invaluable support to this regime. Self-government requires first and foremost the ability to govern oneself. Unless people have control of their passions and appetites and the virtues necessary for self-reliance, they are not able to live as free men. They will always be slaves to their passions and easily forced into the service of others. The founders were appealing to universal, timeless truths which are knowable through human reason about what it means to be a human being and what makes political institutions just or unjust. These are truths that ancient Greek and Roman teachers articulated, medieval scholars expounded upon, and Enlightenment thinkers developed. Which is not to say that they believed that these truths had always universally been understood or practiced by human beings or political associations in the past, but simply that they were truths which could have been discovered or known by reason alone, and by which they could rightly judge the government that they were leaving and the institutions that they hoped to establish. They believed that by outlining in the Declaration the abuses of the British Crown, anyone reading the offenses could perceive the objective wrongness or injustice of them. They understood that natural law is universal in the same way that the laws of physics are universal. So whether you recognize these laws or not, they are going to act upon you in the same way that gravity does. And gravity has been acting on human beings since the beginning of time, even if it was not discovered until the 17th century, and it will continue to act upon us until the end of days. So the act of crafting and publishing the Declaration was an act demanded by the laws of nature and in deference to nature's God. The next part of the Declaration is the American Creed, what I'm going to call the American Creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Something that is self-evident is something, the proof of which is contained in the thing itself. So we might say that it's obvious. But what was declared self-evident in the Declaration? That all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. In what way are all men created equal? Certainly not in the possession or exercise of virtues or natural abilities, certainly not in wealth, certainly not in the possession of certainly not in their physical attributes, but rather they are all created equal in the possession of their natural, unalienable rights. And what are unalienable rights? They're rights that can't be divorced from the possessor. You can't take them away. So if you say man or human being, the founders are claiming that it is obvious that you are speaking about a kind of being that is equal to all others of those beings in the possession of those inalienable rights. And man is the kind of creature which can come to know these truths about himself and his fellow men. And in fact, the natural equality among men is made evident by the inequality in nature, namely between man and the other animals. Only human beings can give arguments. Only human beings can give and receive reasons about matters of right and wrong. It is a peculiarity of human beings that we possess a perception of good and evil, just or unjust. No one argues that you should get the dog's permission from the pound before you take him home. Nobody thinks that you need a contract to put a saddle on a horse or put him to work on your farm, because it is obvious that they are not equal. I love dogs, I love horses, don't get me wrong. Among the rights from which human beings cannot justly be alienated are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And these rights come from the Creator, not from government. Government is created by men to protect their rights that come from the Creator. Why these three? Life is the first in order of all our rights, from which all others spring. If you are not alive, you cannot exercise any rights. Liberty is the means by which we exercise all other rights, and the pursuit of happiness is the end towards which all other rights are directed. And because all human beings possess these inalienable rights, government must be by the consent of the governed. 50 years after the Declaration was published, Jefferson was invited to attend the annual July 4th celebration in Washington, D.C. Too old and infirm to attend, he sent his regrets with the following observation about the representative government that they had bestowed upon the nation. Quote, "May it be to the world what I believe it will be, to some parts sooner, to other parts later, but finally to all, the signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves, and to assume the blessings and security of self-government. That form which we have substituted restores the free right to the unbounded exercise of reason and freedom of opinion. All eyes are opened or opening to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. These are grounds for hope for others." These assertions that all men are created equal and that they must of right, because of their nature as a rational creature, be allowed to govern themselves, or at least have a hand in governing themselves, was no less controversial then than it is today. Just like today, there were obvious objections to the claims of human equality and to the claim that the government established by those founders actually did burst the chains that many lived under. None the least of these objections was the institution of slavery. In response to the First Continental Congress, British essayist Samuel Johnson wrote, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps of liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" He recognized the apparent hypocrisy of the founders in claiming equality and liberty for themselves while denying it to the slaves so many of them owned. Jefferson himself was aware of the inconsistency between the principles enshrined in the Declaration and the constitutional order that he helped to establish and the slave-run plantation that he owned. In his notes on the state of Virginia, Jefferson made the following observation about the institution of slavery and its impact on owners. "This is so true that the proprietors of slaves, a very small portion indeed, are ever seen to labor. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed our only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that those liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that considering numbers, nature, and natural means only, a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation, is among possible events, that it may become probable by the supernatural interference. The Almighty has no attribute which can take sides with us in such a contest. So Jefferson knew that slavery was bad for the owners because it made them lazy, and it made them more violent and more vicious. But more importantly, it would take just one turn of the wheel of fortune, and those enslaved people would be the ones dominating, and they would have no claim of justice that God could listen to, right? That they would deserve what would come to them. The founders were men who believed the words that they wrote and the moral principles that they espoused, but they were also solidly anchored in the particular political realities in which they found themselves. Slavery was not introduced to the continent with the start of the War of Independence, nor with the ratification of the Constitution. It was part of the legacy of the English, French, and Spanish settlers. And at the time of independence, there were slaves in every colony, and by the time the Constitution was being ratified, there were nearly 700,000 slaves in America. In an 1820 letter to John Holmes discussing slavery and the Missouri question, Jefferson wrote, "But as it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation in the other." Like many at the time, Jefferson recognized that keeping slaves violated the very core principles of the American regime. Keeping slaves was unjust. But he also understood that there was no easy answer to the question of how to bring slavery to a satisfactory end. There is no way that the predominantly Southern slave-owning states would ratify the Constitution of 1787, and without their support, the Union would dissolve. There was a very real and reasonable concern that freeing tens or hundreds of thousands of slaves at once would result in civic unrest. And even if the abolition of slavery were done over time, would the two races be able to live together in peace? Would it be best to return the slaves to Africa through recolonization, even though almost none of the slaves had ever lived in Africa or knew anything about African culture? Would they even want to return to Africa? And at least in Jefferson's case, there was also personal moral shortcomings that got in the way of him freeing his slaves. He was perpetually in debt, so he couldn't free them. He could only sell them, which he did after his death. But this gets at the heart of the difficulty of human freedom and organizing political institutions with a view to moral ends. Even when we know what is good, we don't always want to choose it. And even when we do want to choose it, we don't always have the ability to choose it. That said, the founders did believe that they were organizing national political institutions in such a way as to put slavery on the path of ultimate extinction. States began abolishing slavery in 1780, and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which established government for the new territories, outlawed slavery in new territories. It's important to note that the U.S. Constitution never included any explicit mention of slavery. The words slave and slavery never appear in the Constitution. It certainly did contain compromises around slavery, but the framers were very intentional about not including those words because they did not want to defile the national charter with their inclusion, and because they recognized the power of law to teach. And they wanted the Constitution to teach freedom, not slavery. And up until 1854, when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was adopted, repealing the Missouri Compromise, the policy of the federal government had remained committed to preventing the spread of slavery to the territories where it had not existed. But Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, who harbored an ambition for the presidency, became the foremost advocate for popular sovereignty, believing that embracing the principle would ease sectional tensions and arguing that it was the sacred right of the people who would populate the territories to vote slavery up or to vote it down. He thought that Congress shouldn't have a say in that question. Douglas's championing of popular sovereignty and upending of the national prohibition against spreading slavery to territories where it had not existed had very important unintended consequences that ultimately led the nation to civil war. Two of those unintended consequences are that it fractured the Democratic Party and gave rise to the anti-slave Republican Party, and it inspired Abraham Lincoln, the circuit court attorney and previously underwhelming congressman from Illinois, to revive his political career, first by writing letters and giving speeches, and then by running against Douglas for his Senate seat. Although Lincoln lost the Senate race, the campaign changed our national trajectory and provided the clearest articulation and defense of the moral foundations of American politics and the tyrannical nature of its alternative, the theory of popular sovereignty, which is a form of moral relativism. I don't know if any of you watched the recent so-called debate among Republican hopeful presidential candidates. I did not. You can't get those hours of your life back, ladies and gentlemen. Life is too short. But I did spend 17 hours this summer in preparation for this talk listening to the theatrical recordings of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. I highly recommend them. But if you only have 3 hours, I would recommend listening to the last debate. These debates are remarkable for several reasons. They each lasted 3 hours. 3 hours. And second, the argumentation is masterful. While our contemporary candidates seem incapable of holding a thought for 60 to 90 seconds, these men wove reasoned arguments for 60 to 90 minutes at a time. And while there was some casting of aspersions about character and some he said, some innuendo and intrigue, these were really meaty, profoundly relevant arguments, and they are relevant to today's political issues as well. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all 17 hours worth of debates. It's okay. The arguments that are laid forth there are actually incredibly relevant to abortion and gender issues in particular. But even before Lincoln harangued Douglas into agreeing to debate him, he began dismantling Douglas's arguments in favor of popular sovereignty with his 1854 speech at Peoria. In this speech, Lincoln laid out his objections to the Kansas-Nebraska Act and attacked the morality of slavery itself. Lincoln foresaw that the act would lead to national agitation and probably violence over slavery, which would surely spread to the territories now. He dismissed the claims that climate and geography of the territory would be a natural prohibition to slavery. Evil has a way of going where it's permitted. Lincoln also recognized that despite its name, the doctrine of popular sovereignty actually undermines self-government because it would willingly spread slavery, and slavery denies the slave the right to participate in ruling and being ruled. So it undermines popular government by nature. He argued that the slaves were people, not animals, and therefore possessed certain natural rights. He says, "If the Negro is a man, why then my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal, and that there can be no moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another. There can never be a right to do a wrong, so there can never be a moral argument for slavery." Douglas also frequently argued that he had no opinion on the question of slavery. He frequently refrained, "I don't care whether slavery is voted up or voted down." And he argued that because slaves are property, the owners should have the right to transport them just like they transport their livestock or spirits. Lincoln's response is instructive. When Judge Douglas says that whoever or whatever community wants slaves, they have a right to have them, he is perfectly logical if there is nothing wrong with the institution. But if you admit that it is wrong, he cannot logically say that anybody has a right to do wrong. So it's only logical to say that the community has a right to introduce slavery if slavery is moral. But if it is immoral to own slaves, then the community has no right to introduce the wrong to the territory. If you say that slavery is something that people ought to be able to have, then you are saying slavery is not wrong. Lincoln goes on, when he says that slave property and horse property and hog property are alike, all to be allowed to go into the territories upon the principles of equality, he is reasoning truly if there is no difference between them as property. But if the one is property held rightfully and the other is wrong, then there is no equality between the right and the wrong. So that, turn it in any way you can, in all the arguments sustaining the democratic policy and in the policy itself, there is a careful, studied exclusion of the idea that there is anything wrong with slavery. Lincoln often encountered arguments justifying slavery, so he created this little dialogue, it's a very short thread, to disprove all of the arguments, why they are all wrong. He says, if A can prove, however, conclusively that he may of right enslave B, why may not B snatch the same argument and prove equally that he may enslave A? You say A is white and B is black. It is color then, the lighter having the right to enslave the darker? Take care, by this rule, you are to be the slave of the first man you meet with a fairer skin than your own. You do not mean color exactly. You mean the whites are intellectually the superiors of the blacks and therefore have the right to enslave them. Take care again. By this rule, you are to be slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. But you say, it's a question of interest, and if you can make it your interest, you have the right to enslave another. Very well. And if he can make it his interest, he has the right to enslave you. He just gets rid of all of the objections, all of the arguments in favor of slavery. Lincoln does not use the term legal fiction to describe slavery, but I think it's a useful phrase for us to understand these arguments and to see how they apply, how these principles apply to current political questions, especially abortion. Lincoln is pointing us to the truth of the political and moral reality of slavery. Slaves are humans, which means that they are endowed by nature with all the rights of any other human. That they are treated like property is a fabrication of the law that is unjust. So using the law to classify human beings as other or less than so that they can rob those people of their rights and dignity is always unjust and has been the method of genocidal tyrants throughout history. Although Douglas won the Senate election, history has proven that Lincoln was right in his expectation that popular sovereignty would do more to aggravate regional differences than to ease them, and that slavery would either have to be abolished nationally or become a nationwide institution. And I believe that his defense and amplification of the founding principles was a gift to humanity. But even as Lincoln was so eloquently defending the principles of natural right and the laws of nature and the possibility and demands of free government in America, European philosophers were articulating a very different understanding of nature, history, rights, and politics in schools of thought known as historicism. Broadly speaking, historicism is a mode of thinking in which the basic significance of specific social contexts of the time, the place, the local conditions is central. Historicism rejects the claim that there can be immutable moral truths applicable to all men at all times. Historicism also embraces a belief in the progress of the scientific understanding of history. So history is not merely one damn thing after another, but rather it's moving towards some final end, and it's guided by the spirit of, he's not there, it's okay that I said that. These ideas began making their way to America in the late 19th century, especially through emerging universities and most notably Johns Hopkins, which was founded in 1876 for the express purpose of bringing German educational model to the United States, and it featured faculty from that were educated in Germany. The modern research university is a direct result of this movement, and the graduate social science departments can be understood as the applied research arm of the administrative state today. Politically, these ideas took shape in the progressive movement in America, a movement that transformed both major political parties and ushered in what we may call the age of political liberalism. Although the progressive era in America is dated by historians as spanning from the 1890s to the 1920s, we are still living in a world transformed and defined by the theories of progressivism. Among the early doctoral graduates of Johns Hopkins was one Woodrow Wilson, 28th President of the United States. At Johns Hopkins, Wilson enthusiastically consumed these German thinkers and embraced their theories on governments, particularly the emphasis on distinguishing between administration over politics. Wilson had a prodigious academic career culminating in his service as the president of Princeton University. While at Princeton, he established himself as a great advocate of progressivism in education, and he captured the attention of the Democratic Party players, who later tapped him to become the governor of New Jersey, and he used that to springboard to become president. So Wilson's important for this lecture, not primarily because he was president, but more so because of his considerable scholarly contributions to the development and the theories of progressivism. The progressives believed in, well, progress. They wanted dynamic change and transformation both in government and in society. Progressivism rejects the founder's strong conviction that government, to be just, must be limited both in scope and powers. Progressivism rather advances the belief that government exists to administer social and economic reforms so that people can actually enjoy greater material and social equality. Hence the emphasis on research universities to train future generations of scientists, researchers, and administrative experts. And these experts, armed with all of the scientifically produced research and data, should be empowered to craft and administer policies that will bring out the desired policy outcomes without the hassle of the political process. You'll notice that this approach to governance does not consult with the governed very much. There is an underlying belief that the experts know what the right thing to do is. So you should just let them do it. And the experts who know best are the experts who work with and for the government. We see this in very concrete ways today in the ever-expanding administrative state that governs us. Think of all the governmental agencies that you have to interact with daily, directly or indirectly. Think of how state or national emergencies are dealt with. Consider how COVID was handled, or don't. Think of how public schools are administered and what their missions are. The explosion in colleges and universities and the emphasis on having degrees and certificates to do anything is also part of this legacy and the progressive faith in expertise. But consider also how all these administrative agencies and institutions impact civic life. Another important part of the legacy of progressivism is cultural liberalism. I'm going to skate through this part so that we can end on time. So cultural liberalism. While loosening morals and social mores were on display during the Roaring 20s, things really took off in the 60s with the sexual revolution and the rise of identity politics. During this time, we saw the introduction of the birth control pill, psychedelic drugs, free love movement, no-fault divorce, and increasing social unrest. As one Charles Kessler puts it, liberals now came to believe that the purpose of government is to take charge of your necessities so you can live in a new kind of freedom, the freedom of liberation, which is really freedom from responsibility. Identity politics began to take root during this time as well. As Kessler also notes, women's liberation could not be the liberation of an individual woman alone. It had to be the liberation of the sisterhood. Individual homosexuals could not be fully liberated. They needed the support of their peers. So what began as an individual kind of liberation became group forms of liberation. Although Woodrow Wilson and his early 20th century contemporaries, most of whom were still fairly churched and straight-laced and overtly racist, would have had a hard time recognizing themselves in today's progressives, the intellectual heritage is very straightforward. As soon as you disconnect morality and politics from nature, anything goes. And if you dare to raise a question or object to the new sexual norms or identity politics, if you suggest that these trends are harmful and bad, you risk being classified, you risk being chastised for trying to impose your morality where it does not belong. When speaking about popular sovereignty, I described it as a form of moral relativism. Progressivism is grounded in the same kind of moral relativism because it asserts that the rightness or wrongness of an act or principle is contingent upon the particular historical and political circumstances. When divorced from enduring principles of right and wrong, politics becomes incredibly unstable. In 1992, the U.S. Supreme Court in Planned Parenthood v. Casey held that at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life, whatever that means. What happens when one person's concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe comes into conflict with another person's? Because it's going to come into conflict. How do we determine whose concept is right or deserving of preference? How do we make judgments? And we will make judgments. Human beings cannot exist without making judgments. The result of moral relativism is not that there is no right or wrong. It's that we have no way of accessing the information, so we have no way of interacting in meaningful ways with other people, especially with those peoples whose concepts we reject. And it usually leads to violence. Aristotle observed that nature does nothing in vain, and man alone is gifted with the faculty of language. Only humans can give and receive reasons over matters of right and wrong, and not merely what gives us pleasure or pain. Man alone possesses a perception of good and evil, justice and injustice. The polis is most precisely an association of people who share some common understanding of ways of life that are right or wrong, just or unjust. They agree to arrange their lives together in such a way as to cultivate morality with one another. There would be something deeply weird and obviously missing from a community that did not speak with a moral voice to forbid things that are wrong. Can you imagine trying to stop rape by incentivizing, hey, if you don't rape, you can get a new DVD player? That would be weird, right? Like everybody would, that'd just be weird. When a regime ceases to concern itself with issues of right and wrong or educating for virtue and against vice, it ceases to be a polis and it sinks to the level of covenant or contract. When de Tocqueville came to visit America in the 1830s to learn why America's constitutional republic had been so successful, he observed that Americans like to form associations, and not primarily political associations, all sorts of associations. Religious associations, associations to build a bridge or a school, make an inn, things for fun, all sorts of associations. And he was impressed at how well the organizers would set a goal and then go about getting the members on board with it and get to the business of achieving the goal for which it was created, none of which required political force. And these associations helped to cultivate an invaluable sense of community and civic friendship that allowed those same people to peaceably resolve many very contentious political questions. If we want America to be a place with healthy political institutions, we have to understand the true foundations for political freedom. We have to return to our ancient faith. We have to use moral language to discuss the political issues at hand because they are all moral issues. But we also have to cultivate virtue in our own lives so that we can be living witnesses to those principles we espouse. We have to be willing to engage in conversations that are difficult and to speak the truth with plain language and with love to our neighbors and our family members, remembering that a conversation is a give and take exercise. And if we're going to be able to have these conversations, we have to cultivate civic friendship, and participating in voluntary associations like this community right here at Transfiguration is a good start. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, very much. We certainly have time for Q&A. If anybody would like to, just raise your hand. I'll come to you with the microphone. Amelia, please.
My question is just or an observation, and maybe you could speak to this, but sometimes I myself am concerned that the Christian community, and maybe Catholics also, that we're so almost afraid of being around those dreadful kind of people, which are, so to speak, those who are not Christians, or maybe they are very secular. I guess I'll use that word, it's a little more neutral. But my concern is I feel that so many of our institutions have been abandoned to the seculars because the good people, so to speak, who understand that there's right and wrong and there's nature, objective truth, have pulled out because they can't, I don't know, maybe that's what it is, to have the capacity to be polite and have civic friendships, even with people who disagree with you on some things, and not vilify them so greatly that it's so polarizing and everyone is on different sides and everyone refuses to speak to each other. And I think we do not, how should I put it, I told one of my friends she runs a pro-life agency, and I said, we must not forget that in the early centuries, the early Christians reached out to all those secular people and the Romans. They did not vilify them so strongly, but I feel it's almost as if we've lost that capacity to have hold our own for who I am, but still engage the otherness of the other, or whatever you want to put it.
Right, thank you. So you're asking, how do we, is it our fault? Is it our fault that I think, well, the choir needs to be preached to as well. Well, I think that I think that one of the problems that we have as a people, and particularly, we need to own this as Catholics, is that we expect that the institutional church is going to come up with all the solutions. And what Tocqueville saw is that, no, actually, guess what? It's your job to invite some people over and have a dinner party, or even just invite them over for s'mores and have conversations. It's my job to invite people to have conversations. It's my job. Oh, there's a problem. I see a problem. It's my job then to try and come up with I don't need to look to the institutional church or to the government to come up with a solution. That's my job. But also, one of the most important political virtues that we have to cultivate is courage. We have to have courage to live out the virtues, both our moral virtues and our political virtues. We have to be willing to say, it's a baby. It's a baby that you're killing. We have to be willing to speak simple truths plainly, but not to equivocate, frankly. Yeah. But the truth is the truth. The truth is the truth, and it's everybody's truth.
So my question is more about a word that you used, and of course it escapes me right now, but it's instead of administration, you used...
Politics versus administration?
No, more of the regime.
Okay.
Regime. So I'm curious as to why that word was something you used as opposed to, say, administration. That's all.
Thank you. So administration in government is a very new term, right? We didn't talk about administration until really the progressive era. So regime refers to the whole political culture and institutions, right? It's the whole governance. That's a good question. Thanks. Thanks, Kate. Deacon Dan?
Yeah, Jessica, you said that, would you be, kind of a lot of us saw, well, okay, Roe v. Wade was overturned. Great. Push back to the states. Great, where they can, decide for themselves. That goes against sort of the principles that you were, and that you can, do you envision some sort of a gathering national consensus from that's a better outcome obviously, than just letting the states decide. And so we just happen to be in a state that's just decided absolutely terribly and horrendously. And so that we are kind of living through that sort of Douglas conclusion. And so what is your vision for maybe the pro-life movement moving forward?
The rapture. No, just kidding. Just kidding. I think that this is one of those points where we have to recognize that politics is really messy, and it's not going to be a good, clean solution. We're going to have wins in some places, and we're going to have losses in other places, but we have to keep making the argument in very simple, straightforward language. The truth is that we could get a lot of agreement on things like partial birth abortion, late-term abortion, if we talk about it in very plain language. The truth is that many people are just willfully ignorant, and so we have to not let them be. People don't know what is actually happening, and when you hear the narrative being produced, it's always and only the very hardest cases. So then we need to stop the conversation right there and say, okay, great, so you mean that you are only going to support abortion in these hardest, most difficult cases? No, that's not what you mean, because it's still a baby, and that's still a mother who's going to be harmed. We have to be straightforward, but still kind, but we can't compromise on the principle, but we will have to compromise on some of the policies. Hadley Arkes is very good on this question. He and Michael Ullman, who was my dissertation advisor, were the men who authored the Born Alive Victims of Abortion Act, and they were championing this from the beginning. That it's a debate, right? That anybody could question that a baby that has been born should be given treatment. Most people don't know that that's a problem. We have to let them not be ignorant. That's our job. That's our job. But it's going to be messy, and it's going to be imperfect.
Question coming up here.
I will also, just to go to that, I think that we have to be very vehement that the purpose of overturning Roe was not so that we could have abortion destination states like we do now, right? That wasn't the point of all the pro-lifers who were working to overturn Roe. That wasn't the point. And so we have to keep stressing what the point is. We have to promote the culture of life, and we have to live it in ways that will hurt sometimes.
So you know, Jessica, that my sort of stance on this whole thing, but in terms of abortion or any of these other hot button issues that are going on right now, the question I have is, okay, so the United States was not founded to be a Christian nation. It's not a theocracy. But does it work without Christian citizens? If people, I mean, we've run on the cultural capital, the fumes, right? But they're almost gone. And we have a very strong but very, very small minority of believing Christians in this country. Lots of people say they're Christian, but they aren't believing. They don't really believe that something is right all the time or wrong all the time. How do we run this country with citizens who really deeply do not believe in right and wrong? I don't see how we can do it. I mean, certainly if we have citizens who have some moral compass, then we can have those conversations, but conversation becomes impossible when you don't share any vocabulary. So I guess I'd like to know what you think about that.
So I think one reality is that all regimes will come to an end in this lifetime. Like there's no reason for us to expect that this regime is going to last until the end of days. I know I'm a downer, but that is the truth, right? That every great regime has come to an end. Are we on life support right now? Yeah, we probably are. I don't think that you can have a large republic endure in perpetuity without the support of the moral virtues that are cultivated by Christianity. I just don't. I don't know of any other virtue inculcating institution that can produce the kind of people with the kind of virtue that is necessary to sustain freedom without Christianity. So again, that puts the onus on us. Like, we've done our part, we've had our kids, but like, we actually haven't finished doing our part because we're still well, I mean, maybe we, I don't know, it's not a birth announcement, just so we're clear. We have to keep engaging, right? Like, we have to keep, and it's gonna feel like we're hitting our head against the wall because we're gonna make the same argument. But human beings are kind of dumb, and you have to repeat it again and again and again and again and again, and then some people are gonna get it. But that's the only hope that we have, I think, truly, and we can't be silent. I think that the reason that the moral language is so lost is because too many of us just sat back and let it go. Like, oh, I don't wanna get involved in that. I mean, that is the reality, that there will be very real consequences to our lack of courage.
Final question, Ralph Baer.
Kind of question, kind of comment, but the abortion debate's kind of changed somewhat. Watching it progress from 72 to now, is a lot of people got the attitude that we got them convinced. It's a live person. Their attitude is, who cares? Mm-hmm. I look back in 1968, 2 documents were written. Paul Ehrlich wrote the population bomb with all kinds of predictions that we were overpopulated by 84, we'd be starving to death and everything else. Pope Paul VI wrote Humane Vitae. If you read those 2 documents, find out which one was prophetic. But people aren't listening to Pope Paul VI. They're looking at Paul Ehrlich and they think we still got a population bomb. Mm-hmm. And it's a matter of who cares, we need to cut that population down.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, like, for all of us who are here, we have to remember that that God doesn't ask for success, he asks for faithfulness, which means that we have to get up and fight the invincible fight every day. But we have to do it with all of the tools in our tool belt, which means we need to be here, right? And not just on Sundays. We can't just be Sunday Catholics. It has to infuse, and Father did not pay me to say this part, but like it has to infuse our whole life, right? We have to be the light and the salt. We can't just sit back. Are people different today? Yeah, because the law teaches, and for 4 decades, 5 decades, we had a law teaching us that it doesn't matter that it's a baby, a woman gets to kill it anyway. That's a really profound message. So now we have to work on changing that lesson.
Another round of applause for Dr. Chastek, please. Very, very grateful, Dr. Chastek. It was a wonderful talk. Very grateful. Anybody who has further questions, we'll have a little reception out in the gathering space afterwards. I would ask that we would kind of clear out by 8:30. Still gives us a half hour. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. We do have some light refreshments out there. These talks, we're very grateful to be able to offer them for free, but as you might imagine, there are some expenses, and so you should feel so called. Please put a few dollars or more in the buckets. If you do write a check, it should go out to Transfiguration. Memo line should say lecture series. And stay tuned for further details about upcoming lectures. Doctor, thanks again.